In September of 2021, Lia Thomas began participating as a member of the Penn women's team. Lia, formerly Will, had personal best times in every freestyle event that were faster than the women's world records. Once the season began, Thomas was leading the country in multiple events while only placing in the top 500 in those events on the men's team. Thomas later became an NCAA champion in the 500-yard freestyle, the first NCAA champion in our women's team history program.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So recently the news broke that Lia Thomas is not going to the Olympics this summer in Paris. The Court of Arbitration decided that Lia is not entitled to try out for the Olympics in the women's category. Lia was expecting NCAA treatment, being allowed to compete in the women's category, even being allowed in the women's locker room. But the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland shut it down and said that the ban on transgender athletes by World Aquatics is perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable, and they were not going to overturn it. So as it stands now, transgender athletes are not allowed to compete in the women's category in women's swimming if they transitioned after the age of 12, if they have gone through any part of male puberty.
Transgender swimmer Lia Thomas, a Westlake graduate, lost a legal battle today and her hopes of making it to the Summer Olympics in Paris next month. Thomas challenged the ban on trans women competing in the highest levels of women's swimming. 3 judges on the Court of Arbitration for the sport dismissed her request for arbitration with the World Aquatics governing body. The court said, quote, that she lacks standing to challenge the policy and the operational requirements in the framework of the present proceeding.
Just 3 years before winning all those accolades and all those awards, Thomas was competing at the University of Pennsylvania, but she was competing as a man. Now, Lia Thomas, she did respond. She calls the ruling discriminatory and deeply disappointing, Anna.
It's not discriminatory against the girls though, is it? It's not discriminatory against female athletes who are forced to compete against a male athlete who has an advantage over them, who has a physical advantage. That's not discriminatory though. They just have to put up with it and shut up. It's not discriminatory to have males in their locker rooms and their objections going unheard for years. That's not discriminatory though, is it? So thankfully, World Aquatics put a stop to it. You can only go so far. The NCAA rolled out the red carpet for this person at the expense of the women. But the World Aquatics has said enough. It's not going to go to Olympic level. We're not going to have Katie Ledecky going up against a male athlete. Nobody's going to want to watch that. And funny enough, Katie Ledecky was asked about Lia Thomas recently. She was asked about the NCAA court case. She was asked about that and she said that she prefers not to get into it. Basically said she wants to stay out of it and just talk about swimming. But she's extremely fortunate that the court made this ruling, because before you know it, she could have been stuck in the locker room with Lia, having to compete against a male athlete. It could have very well have affected her if they didn't put a stop to it. And Clay Travis of Outkick called her a coward.
Katie Ledecky was asked about whether she believed specifically Lia Thomas should be able to compete in women's swimming, and she refused to give an opinion. Katie Ledecky is the best women's swimmer in maybe American history, certainly one of the best ever, currently the best women's swimmer in the world. In a New York Times profile piece, which she requested because she's got a new book coming out. So people out there are like, well, she just doesn't want the attention. No, her PR flack pitched the New York Times on doing a story about her because she has a new book coming out, which shares her story and her opinion on many different issues. She refused to take a stand on whether a man should be able to compete in women's swimming. And I just, the cowardice from so many top female athletes who know how ridiculous this is, who understand better than anybody the difference between biology. My goodness, swimming makes it readily apparent. There is even an insult that Katie Ledecky swims like a man. Well, a man would definitely swim like a man, particularly when he's competing in women's sports. She was asked directly about Lia Thomas winning women's championships, and she refused to answer the question. She's worried about backlash. She's worried about sponsor impact. What she's not worried about is telling the truth. And I find that to be shameful in this modern era. I understand if you don't want to say, if you're an athlete and you say like, hey, are you voting for Biden or Trump? And you're like, I just don't want to get into that. But this goes to the very essence of her competition itself. It would be like if a heavyweight boxer was asked whether a flyweight should be able to compete for the heavyweight, or maybe a better analogy to make it is a flyweight boxer was asked whether a heavyweight boxer was able to compete against him. The flyweight would say no. We're different weight classes. That defeats the entire purpose of boxing. If a 12-year-old baseball team suddenly had a 16-year-old playing on it, then every parent in America would revolt, because that's the reason we have age limits. That's the reason we have weight classes. It's the reason why we have a difference between men's and women's sports. And so the idea that you would have a situation where a prominent women's swimmer would be unable or and unwilling to answer a question despite begging for attention and begging for a profile piece in the New York Times, I think, frankly, is pathetic. Katie Ledecky knows it's BS. She knows that there's no basis whatsoever for men to be identifying as women and winning women's championships. She's too much of a coward to say it. I think it's pathetic. Shame on her.
It's very disappointing when the top athletes can't give a common sense answer. All you have to do is say, absolutely not. That's it. Athletes like that are not thinking about the young girls in college where she was once. She's not thinking about those young girls. She's not thinking about Emma Wayant, who had to compete against Lia and lose a championship to this person or have it stolen from her. She's not thinking about that. And Emma is trying out for the Olympics, so we shall follow her journey and see, how far she gets. But thankfully, none of them have to compete against a man. None of them have to be in the locker room with a man. Because of people like Riley Gaines, who aren't afraid to speak out. Because of people like Paula Scalan, who isn't afraid to speak out, who was a teammate of Lia's. She spoke out against this, and one of the main issues that she highlighted was the locker room situation. And after the news of the arbitration broke out, she asked the question, when is the NCAA going to apologise for forcing young girls to be in the locker room with a man? When are they going to apologise for that? They changed the locker room policy and basically made it an open locker room.
First of all, we were not forewarned we would be sharing a changing space. No one told us, no one asked for our consent. We did not give our consent to undress in front of a male. Yet the only time we became aware of this was when it was presented in front of us and it was too late. So what that kind of looked like in the vein of being extremely transparent, a 6'4", he's actually taller than 6'1", a 6'4" male walks in, disrobes, and is fully intact with male genitalia while we're simultaneously undressing as 18 to 22-year-old girls, and we could do nothing about it. I actually immediately left the locker room, and I went up to one of the officials on the pool deck, and I said, how is this allowed to happen? I understand the guidelines for the competition, but what are the guidelines in regards to the locker room? And he looks at me and word for word says, oh, we actually got around this by making the locker rooms unisex, so it's not a big deal. And I thought about that, and unisex. So this meant that any man could have walked into our locker room, not just a self-identifying female. Any man, any coach, any parent, any official, any man who wanted to would have had full access to, and bare minimum, we weren't forewarned. And actually, Lia Thomas's teammates who dealt with this every single day all year, when they expressed their discomfort to their administration and they sent an email, and I swear I have a screenshot of their response, their administration responded back with, if you feel uncomfortable seeing male genitalia, here's some counseling resources that you should seek. And that's the general consensus of what's happening around the country, which is why I felt it necessary to get in front of colleges and speak.
Paula has testified in Congress multiple times, telling her story. One of the issues she bravely highlighted was that it's triggering to women who have been through assault. Seeing a naked man, in their locker room. As much as the activists want to tell us trans women are women, that doesn't change the fact that these young girls had to be in the locker room with a male, fully intact, clearly a man.
Again, I was silenced for my dissenting viewpoint and felt my First Amendment rights were denied by my university. This is representative of a greater issue, the destruction of free speech. Today, any discussion maintaining the sanctity of women's spaces is labeled transphobic, bigoted, and hateful. What's bigoted and hateful is the discrimination against women and the efforts to erase women and our equal opportunities, dignity, and safe spaces. One might ask, why do I speak so passionately about issues that seem hypothetical, or some may perceive as only impacting a small number of women? This is not hypothetical. This is real. I know women who have lost roster spots and spots on the podium. I know of women with sexual trauma who are adversely impacted by having biological males in their locker room without their consent. I know this because I am one of these women. I was sexually assaulted on June 3rd of 2016. I was only 16 years old. I was able to forgive my attacker, but violence against women still exists. Let us not forget the viral Me Too movement that empowered female victims to speak up. It casts a spotlight on the widespread prevalence of sexual assault and abuse, including in scholarly and educational institutions.
They were forced into that situation against their consent. They weren't even pre-warned. They didn't even have the decency to warn them and give them a heads up that when they walk into the locker room, this is what you're going to see. And bear in mind, we're talking about swimming. Not just any old swimming at the elite level. So when they put on their swimsuits, apparently it takes 15 to 20 minutes to put on a swimsuit. Skin-tight swimsuits that can't just be quickly put on and off. So of course, we're dealing with a situation here where you're forced to be undressed in front of a male athlete, and you're also in a position where you're seeing everything when this person is undressing. Paula said that young girls went into the broom closet with the mops and buckets to change. And that's where I would have got changed. Guarantee you. Well, I probably wouldn't have. I would have just thrown away my whole NCAA swimming career, to be honest. I couldn't do it. And Riley Gaines and Paula have confirmed that they've never received an apology. Why would you not, at least out of respect, apologize? Or at least say, I'm sorry you went through that. I'm sorry we put you through that. That was not our intention. No respect for these young women. From day one, it was always about the male athlete. And that's what these trans activists are all about. The male athlete. They couldn't care less about the women. And they justify their discrimination against women by using the word inclusion. That has now become a dirty word because of them. Inclusion justifies discriminating against women, apparently. Inclusion justifies destroying women's safe spaces, which is what the locker room should be. So Paula asked a simple question on X, and it's been viewed over 10 million times, and there's been an outpouring of support for her, because it's a reminder of what these young women went through, all in the name of gender ideology, allowing a male athlete to steal their championships, to steal their medals, to steal their accolades, to steal their trophies. Because Lia went from competing with men in the men's category straight over into the women's. And now we're supposed to believe that this is fair? So Paula said, okay, but is anyone going to apologize for forcing us to undress with him 18 times a week? Wow. 18 times a week. It's unforgivable. It's absolutely unforgivable. They showed no thought for how this would affect the girls. All they cared about was their publicity. That's why Lia got to hold the trophy. Upon tying with Riley Gaines, they gave the trophy to the male athlete. I'm sorry for what you girls went through, and that none of the people who should have stood up for you when it was happening did. I think it's unlikely that he or any of the people who actually owe you a major apology will apologize. Keep exposing them. Paula replied, I am too, but it's sad that not a single one of my teammates is willing to say this out loud with me. We all have to speak up. Wow. And that's the other side of the problem, are the actual women who refuse to speak up, the Katie Ledeckys of this world. They have either drank the Kool-Aid or are cowards. It's been the same with skateboarding. Whole lot of private conversations where they are supportive, but absolute silence publicly. It's insane. So it's so sad to hear that. I'm sorry. Penises don't belong in women's locker rooms. There you go. And World Aquatics, I commend them for protecting women's swimming. Absolutely. But I don't even agree that if they transition before the age of 12 that they should be allowed to compete, or if they transition before puberty that they should be allowed. Because transitioning, so-called transitioning before the age of 12 still doesn't make them a woman. It still doesn't make them female. Women's sports should be for females only, not people who have gone through this horrible experiment. Paula responded, and did you ever think that would need to be said out loud? The part about how long it takes for the swimsuits, Paula confirmed it. Per an ex, I hear it takes something like a highly vulnerable hour for a competition swimmer to change. Is that basically correct? Paula responded, yes, racing suits take a long time to get on, at least 20 minutes. Wow. Don't play the evil game by calling it her. Paula said, I said him. New York Post needs to figure it out. Oh my goodness, listening to these news clips, reading these articles, I'm sure you've noticed that they insist on using she, her pronouns, to the point where it gets confusing sometimes. So you see how far this goes. Our news media, even the so-called conservative outlets, are afraid to tell it as it is. And then, of course, that's the part I don't get. He identifies as a woman. He's not a perv getting off on women's bodies. What's your problem? I don't care how the person identifies. They're not a woman. Men do not belong in women's locker rooms. It's amazing how people put so much stock on identity. How can you say that the person isn't a perv? How do you know? How do you know? That's why we don't allow it. And some of the responses to that. The minute he walked into their dressing room, he violated each and every woman there. Don't pretend you don't know that. Absolutely. I don't understand the conditioning that people have gone through where they think it's okay for a man to be in the locker room simply because of identity. What does identity have to do with anything when it comes to biology? The fact is, this is a male, and he should never have been allowed in their locker room. He could have got changed somewhere else. There are family changing rooms. We don't care how he identifies, he's a man. How do you know he's not perving on women's bodies? Exactly. The problem is that he's not actually a woman, whatever he identifies as.
Lia Thomas, who used to be Will Thomas, who went from a man to a woman, is now dating someone that used to be a man that's now a woman, and they consider themselves lesbians.
As confusing as that sounds,
Explain
if you could follow that, yes.
So, and this isn't an episode of South Park.
No, this is, I actually had someone send me the girlfriend's Instagram page, to which I obviously looked at. It is in fact a male who has transitioned, so the same type of transgender persons as Lia. Very interesting dynamic, what they engage in, the different things. I mean, it's probably too explicit to even say. But it's mind-blowing now sitting back, looking at this in front of my eyes and knowing we had to share a locker room with this person.
Are some of the things they do satanic, would you say?
Yes.
Reporting on the Daily Wire, Evita, has got posts that someone they believe is Lia Thomas, and again, she has not denied this, thumbs upping this, basically it's this autogynephilia where it's a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a female. And there are all these images liked by who we believe is Lia Thomas, though it's spelled differently, but it's linked back to Lia Thomas's actual girlfriend and so on, where there's clearly a male dressed as a woman looking at themselves in the mirror as like a cartoon character with a full-on erection. I mean, kinky, weird stuff. And if Lia Thomas is really just a man who has a propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a female, and then they subjected all these poor female swimmers to both that weirdness in the locker room, not to mention Lia dominating all the records, they're owed an apology, not a celebration of this person.
He's obviously a perv. Otherwise, after seeing the distress in the eyes of the women in the changing room, he would have asked for separate space. That's all that needs to be said. There's absolutely no way of knowing if the person is a predator of some kind. There's no way of knowing that. That is the main issue with these policies. Once you say that males who identify as women are allowed in a locker room, it says any man is allowed in a locker room. Whether they look like a woman, whether they're standing there shaving, whether they're an autogynephiliac, a predator of some kind. And we're at the point now where they allow rapists, male rapists, into women's prisons. So they have no standards. They're willing to throw women to the wolves. They don't care about women. And that's the issue. And no matter how much a male identifies as a woman, that is something he is never going to be. And that's exactly why he should not be allowed in our sports, and he certainly should not be allowed in our locker rooms. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Like and subscribe, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.